I want to welcome folks back to our 43rd weekly conversation on Zoom. And my guest today is Ann Gass. Good morning, Ann. How are you?
Good morning. I'm just doing fine.
Good. Where are you coming to us from?
I live in Gray.
Oh, Gray, Maine. Very good.
Yeah.
And we started this during the early days of the pandemic. So one of the early questions we were always asking, and we're well past a year now, is how have you been faring through the pandemic?
Well, it turns out that living in the woods in Maine is a marvelous place to kind of wait out a pandemic. And so my husband and I love to hike and ski and be outside. And we have ourselves 25 acres of land, and then we're across the street from 1,000 acres of land for Maine's future land. And so we have a great playground all around us, and we've driven out to the White Mountains. And so we spend a lot of time doing that. Everybody's talking about their COVID-15, how they've gained weight. And I think I've actually lost weight because I've had more time to exercise.
Very good. So the way that you and I think, first more formally came to know one another is serving on a committee that had been established by the Maine State Museum as they were putting together an exhibit in tribute to the women's suffrage movement. And did you wind up having a role beyond being on the committee? Did you have more of an active role in helping to put together the exhibit?
No, not really, because they hired Candace Keynes, and she did a terrific job. And so I did provide some photos, I think, of my great grandmother, Florence Brooks Whitehouse. But aside from that, I just was just like you on the committee.
Okay. And I'm not actually sure of this, when the pandemic, everything's gotten thrown off. But do you know if that exhibit is still up at the Maine State Museum? Well,
No,
actually, the Maine State Museum is essentially closed.
right, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I think it exists online in part. I don't think the full thing is online. I guess the other thing I did, now that I remember, is that I supplied Candace with my binders of all my research material that I put together to support the writing of my first book about my great grandmother. So I have like 7 or 8 3-ring binders full of material that it's all in chronological order from a variety of sources, and just that's what I used to put the book together. And she said it was really valuable in putting the exhibit together.
Well, that's what I wanted to move to next, is why you were interested in the women's suffrage movement, in that you have a very direct family connection to it. So why don't you share with the audience more about it's your grandmother?
Great grandmother.
Great grandmother. Why don't you share more? Tell us who she was and what she did.
Yeah, so Florence Brooks Whitehouse was a Mainer. She was born in Augusta, grew up there, married her, someone I think she must have known from childhood. They went to the public schools together in Augusta, Robert Treat Whitehouse, and they moved to Portland in 1894, and that's where she lived for the rest of her life. She was pretty amazing. She didn't get into suffrage herself until she was in her 40s. But by that time, she'd written a couple of books, novels, romances of the Sudan, based on her travels in the Sudan in the early 1890s, before she got married. And she'd been involved with a progressive movement in Portland, and she was a woman of spirit and very intelligent, and got very frustrated when she started hearing that women should not be voting. She didn't deserve to vote, shouldn't vote, and she ended up kind of doing her own little mini research project into the reasons for and against women's suffrage, and became a convert through that process, and so that was probably around 1913 or so, 1914, and she ended up becoming a leader in the suffrage movement, and was very active in it until suffrage was won in 1920. But I knew none of this when I was growing up. And my family knew that she had been a suffragist, but all of her leadership, all of her work had been forgotten.
So how did you rediscover her?
It was a lot of research. I started out with looking at the scant histories that had been written about Maine suffrage history, and I was really thinking, oh, maybe I'll find her in here. And I was really irritated, actually, that she was described more as a kind of a fringe radical who contributed very little and almost caused more problems than she had solved.
Mhm.
And that's what annoyed me so much. I felt as if I had to write a book about her. But
Mhm.
it also helped that there was a tremendous amount of material when I started looking. I mean, I went through all the Portland newspapers from 1914 to 1920, some of the Lewiston Journal, some of the Kennebec Journal, and I also the Library of Congress has the papers of the National Women's Party and the papers of Carrie Chapman Catt, who ran the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and they have put those on microfilm and sent copies of the microfilm out to other repositories around the country. So I was able to get those the correspondence from those collections sent to me in Portland, or to read at the Portland Library. And I did a lot of the research there, but really the starting point was papers that Florence herself left behind that are now archived at the Maine Historical Society. So that's kind of where I started. And I remember just opening up these boxes of papers and pulling out these telegrams that people at the National Women's Party had sent to Florence in Portland saying, give publicity, so and so and so and so have been arrested for picketing the White House. And I'm thinking, what, why, who are these people, and why were they asking Florence to give publicity? She must have had some kind of major role. And so that really sparked my interest at that point, and I just kept going. And the really fun thing about it, about the book that I ended up writing about her, which is Voting Down the Rose, Florence Brooks White House and Maine's Fight for Women's Suffrage, is that I was able to tell a lot of the story from Florence's own words, because through letters to the editor and through notes and through her correspondence, she left behind a very strong, authentic voice about what she was thinking and feeling during this period.
Mhm. You referred to her as being seen within the movement as being fringe. Was there a particular reason why she was?
Yeah, she started out working with the mainstream National American Women's Suffrage Association through their Maine affiliate, the Maine Women's Suffrage Association, and I think she was really being groomed to take over the Maine Women's Suffrage Association. But then in 1915, Florence Kelley, who was active with the Congressional Union with Alice Paul's new upstart suffrage group, Florence Kelley had a summer place in Naskeag, actually, and so Alice Paul sort of deployed her down to Portland to help kick off the launch of a new Maine affiliate, a Maine branch of the Congressional Union, and she sought Florence's help with that, and Florence ends up becoming the chair of the Maine branch of the Congressional Union. So of course it's the Congressional Union, which becomes the National Women's Party, that did all the picketing at the White House and did some, they burned President Wilson in effigy at one point. I mean, they were the radicals, and they were very much painted that way by the mainstream suffragists and organizations, and who lost almost no opportunity to vilify them in the press, and even went at the national level to the point of trying to get the national newspapers to censor the National Women's Party and its activities, because they thought it was so injurious to the cause.
Mhm.
And but Florence was the lone voice in Maine who was really, actively supporting the National Women's Party through those tumultuous final years of the campaign. And she was under a lot of pressure, especially during the 1917 suffrage referendum, to denounce the Congressional Union, the National Women's Party, and their tactics, and she refused to do it. And so that's why, and the defeat of the 1917 suffrage referendum was laid at the feet of the pickets, the White House pickets. And of course, she was the most visible supporter of them in Maine, most vocal supporter. And so she was kind of tagged with that defeat as well.
Mhm. In your discussion there, you're reminding me that the road to women gaining the right to vote was very laborious. In some ways, it goes back to Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. But then even moving up through the 19 teens, there's a lot of work that's being done. So I want to shine the spotlight a little bit on what was going on in Maine. And I was going to do that through a share screen. And hopefully you can sort of walk us through what the process was in Maine for trying to get women the right to vote.
Yeah, I mean, Maine was very similar to other states. And one of the ways, of course, there are no polls in those days, right? So one of the ways that you can uh, kind of gauge interest in anything is through a petition. And so over the years, there were lots and lots of petitions. In Maine, the first statewide suffrage organization was created, I think in I can't remember, it was 1972 or I mean 1872 or 1874, something like that. But prior, there'd been movement on this even prior to that, I think in the 50s and 60s. So up in the mid-coast area. So Maine had a long history itself of working on the suffrage business. And but you know, through the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the approach that they took primarily was to win suffrage state by state. I mean, of course, in our country, some rights are states' rights and some are national rights or federal rights. And the word that the suffragists got was you're going to be much more successful if you go state by state and get the state legislators to approve suffrage, often through, if the state had it, through some sort of referendum process. So what you're looking at here in the screen is Maine's first ever successful effort to get the legislature to approve a suffrage referendum, which they did in February of 1917, and they set the date of the special election on September 10th later that year. And so the suffragists had a goal here in Maine of gathering signatures from some 10,000 women on this petition to show the legislature there was substantial support from women in Maine. And here's the one this is from Skowhegan, I think you said, David, right?
Correct. Yes.
And Margaret Chase Smith's mom actually signed this petition.
She did.
And you can see how many, I mean, this is Skowhegan, Maine, but there are pages and pages of signatures on this one petition. They did this all over the state. I think I've, Mattawamkeag and a lot of small communities like that, as well as larger cities like Bangor and Portland.
There is actually two sections of it. It's 39 pages long altogether. But what it is like the first half is the typed names, and then the actual signatures are on the second half. So it's roughly about 19 to 20 pages of signatures of women throughout Skowhegan signing this petition. And as you say, this is encouraging the state legislature to vote in favor of women's suffrage.
Yeah, and Maine had adopted fairly recently an initiative and referendum process, and so this is going to go out. Once the legislature approved it, it had to go out to the voters for approval, and of course that would just be the male voters because women couldn't vote. So this is not just these 10,000 signatures were not just an indicator to the legislature about the level of interest from women, but also ultimately to the men who would approve it in referendum vote.
Mm-hmm. And so what were the results of those votes?
Well, the legislature did approve it in February of 1917, sent it out to the voters. But of course, 1917 wasn't really a normal year. I mean, the U.S. enters World War I in April, and instantly all of these women who had said previously, I'm going to work. Oh, there you can see Mrs. Susan Chase there.
Well, no, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Oh, Mrs. Carrie Chase, Skowhegan North Street.
Nice.
That's Margaret Chase Smith's mother.
That's awesome. Yeah. That's great to know. I didn't know that. Yeah, so the U.S. enters World War I in April, and in their final meeting where they decided, the Maine Women's Suffrage Association was deciding whether or not to go for a referendum. Carrie Chapman Catt actually showed up at that meeting and told them, don't do it. You're not ready. You don't have the resources. You don't have the campaign war chest, and you don't have the organizers or the experience. But they were so sure that the good old state of Maine wouldn't let them down that they decided to go ahead and they were euphoric. It was the first time in decades that they actually knew they had the votes in the legislature. And Florence, by the way, was the chair of the legislative committee for the Maine Women's Suffrage Association, had done tremendous amount of work lining up these votes. And so they ended up going for it. And so, you know, they have the legislature approves in February. There's a long winter, really cold, a lot of snow, followed by a very rainy, wet spring. So they couldn't get out. The roads were just sloppy and nasty. I mean, they couldn't get out to do the signature work and and send the speakers around and things until the spring. And by that time, the U.S. was embroiled in this world war, and all of these people who had said, "I'm going to work full time for suffrage. I'm going to work half time on this referendum. I'm going to give all my spare money to it." They do this massive pivot almost overnight to war work, and Red Cross and raising money for the Red Cross and selling bonds and that kind of thing, and including Florence, actually, because both of her two older sons were both enlisted in the war, and they were in the fledgling Air Force. One flew dirigibles. He was in the first group of men trained by Goodyear out in Ohio, and to fly dirigibles, and the other one flew bombers. And so she joined the Red Cross and was very involved with the information. She ran the information bureau for the Red Cross. So it's really not until in the correspondence and stuff, you see it's not till late June that they start even focusing on this upcoming referendum. And then it's July and August. Some of the wealthier women, they're out of town, they're on vacation, they go up to their vacation homes on islands off the coast of Maine or wherever, and Florence is out there. She's in Cumberland County going to Westbrook and all these towns trying to gather those signatures, and she has been by this time sort of kicked out of the Maine Women's Suffrage Association for her refusal to denounce the Congressional Union and the pickets. And so what ends up happening is that her friends organize a completely separate third-party suffrage organization just to work on the 1917 referendum campaign. It's the Suffrage Referendum League of Maine. They organize that in secret, then come to Florence and ask her to serve as the president, and she says yes. And so that's how she works on the 1917 campaign. So there's all of this craziness. There's this enmity, especially on behalf by Maine Women's Suffrage Association against the Congressional Union and Florence, and so that doesn't help either. And so by the end, they can't get it done, and the referendum is defeated on a 2-to-1 basis.
Mm-hmm. And was there a subsequent referendum vote, or was it just the state legislature eventually approved it?
There was a subsequent referendum. It was madness, really, and Florence flagged it as such at the time. But in 1919, Ann Gannett's husband Guy was in the legislature, and she was chair of the Maine Women's Suffrage Association, or maybe it was just the Augusta branch. But in any case, they prevail. One of the strategies that the National American Women's Suffrage Association had employed or encouraged states to employ was, if they couldn't get a full suffrage, full referendum on suffrage through the state legislature, pick it apart, just ask for municipal suffrage, just ask for presidential suffrage. Mm-hmm. And so that's what they did in early 1919, even though they knew they were just a few votes shy in Congress. I think it was through the House, and they just needed a few votes in the Senate mm-hmm. to get the federal amendment approved. But so the Maine Women's Suffrage Association asked Guy Gannett to introduce a bill into the legislature for a presidential suffrage referendum. Mm-hmm. And he does that, and the legislature approves it. And I think originally their intent was just let's just give the women presidential suffrage. Like, they weren't going to send it to a referendum. But the antis joined forces with the Wets, the pro-liquor lobby, mm-hmm. and sent organizers door to door to gather signatures on both of those petitions at once to force a citizens referendum on both prohibition and suffrage, this presidential suffrage bill. And so they get caught up in that, and they're successful in gathering those signatures and forcing it to referendum, which had not been the Maine Women's Suffrage Association's intent. What ends up happening is that just collides with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, because of course, in June of 1919, Congress does finally pass, both houses come up with the necessary 2/3 votes that were required to send it out to ratification of the states. And so Maine is in this really weird position where they've got a presidential suffrage referendum that needs to get scheduled, and ratification of the 19th Amendment. And everybody's terrified that if the voters get to vote on the presidential suffrage bill first, they'll vote it down, and then the legislature won't ratify it, or the 19th Amendment. So there's all this sort of these political, shenanigans and machinations that are happening to make sure that Governor Carl Milliken schedules the ratification of the 19th Amendment first, which he finally does in November, early November of 1919. And there's there's other shenanigans that happen around that, but ultimately the presidential suffrage bill wasn't voted on until the following September, and women got to vote on that as well as men, because they'd been enfranchised at that point. And it's still, there was still a sizable number of people who voted against the presidential suffrage referendum, even though suffrage was the law of the land.
It seems so bizarre to most people today that there would have been a time when women didn't have the right to vote. Can you summarize what the anti-view was, why women should not have the right to vote?
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about it is that it took so long and it was such a hard fight because women were fighting hundreds of years of misogyny that was embedded in our laws and our religions and our social customs, and all of those things believed that women's place was in the home. And it just took a really long time to turn that around and see women as equal to men in every potential sphere. So I think the antis were afraid of some of the things that a lot of conservatives are now. I mean, they were afraid of feminism. They were afraid of lesbianism. They were afraid of women abandoning their homes and taking jobs away from men, and forcing men to assume household duties for which they weren't qualified or suited. And so you just a whole range of they were just sort of forecasting the demise of civilization as we knew it in some ways, if women were enfranchised.
People often ask us about Margaret Chase Smith's role in the movement. She would have been in her late teens, early 20s as it was picking up steam. You reminded me when you said that in 1917, because of the war, a lot of women's energies got shifted over to the war effort. And you mentioned Red Cross, and that's one of the things that she did. She did volunteer work for the Red Cross. But I did point out, we did see that her mother was involved from the standpoint of signing those petitions. And the way I always phrase it is that, and the other area that Margaret was very much involved, and this is an outlet that a lot of women had before they could be more formally involved in politics and society, was through women's groups. She was a very active member of women's groups, and talk about the idea of the way that women often were able to get involved in the political sphere was through their work through women's groups. She helped to start a women's group here in Scotland called Cirrhosis, and then became very involved in BPW, Business and Professional Women's Club, both here in Skowhegan and on the state level as well. But the way I always sum it up is she may not have been a suffragette, but she was definitely the beneficiary of women getting the right to vote, in that she becomes the first woman who gets elected to both the House of Representatives and the United States Senate. And that happens in 1948, which is exactly 100 years after the Seneca Falls Convention.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Well, and one of the things that happens in in the aftermath of the ratification of the 19th Amendment in Maine and in other states, but is that there's instantly a challenge. Well, it's like, okay, well, the 19th Amendment says that women can vote, but what does that doesn't mean that they can hold office. They can't hold elective office. They can't hold appointive offices. And so Carl Milligan, who was very supportive of the suffragists, asks the Maine state Supreme Court to rule on this question. And so there's in 1921, they finally get around to ruling on it. And they say, yes, actually women can be appointed and they can run for elective office. So, I mean, I always say that the suffrage, ratification wasn't the end. It was the end of the beginning. There was so much other work that was needed to be done afterward for women to, to gain rights like the ability to serve on juries or to take out credit in their names. I mean, and the right to not be sexually assaulted in the workplace. I mean, those things are were litigated, advocated for and litigated, protections against those kinds of things or opportunities to be equal with men were fought over straight through the 20th century. Some of them not really getting resolved until into the 1970s and 80s. So it, and certainly Margaret Chase Smith was a beneficiary of all of that work. She stood on their shoulders for sure. And she paid her dues in other respects because she was a supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment.
Well, I was just going to say that, like you say, the ratification of the 19th Amendment is not the end of the story. And yeah, as early as 1948, she's advocating that there needs to be an Equal Rights Amendment as part of the Constitution as well.
Right, and just so we're clear on this, first of all, the ERA has never been ratified. It was introduced by Alice Paul and Crystal Eastman authored it in 1923 and got it introduced into Congress in that year, and it has never been ratified. So it was a big boost for Margaret Chase Smith to come out in favor of it and to speak in favor of it in Congress. And her support was invaluable because there were a lot of concerns about what the effects of the ERA would be, especially in those early decades. And there was a lot of concern that it would end the protections that women had won and their advocates had won, especially around workplace protections, not lifting heavy weights or having to work at night, and those kinds of things. And so having other women leaders come out in favor of it really helped get it out of the sort of graveyard that it had been lingering in for years and years. And that you see actually in the late 1940s and into the 50s that it starts to turn around and they start getting more support from national entities like the National League of Women Voters, for example.
Mm-hmm. So you have mentioned that you wrote a biography about your great-grandmother. Is there a way that people can purchase that book?
Yeah, it's available on Amazon, also through Maine Authors Publishing. If you go to their website and just look up in their nonfiction books that they've published, it's there and it can be purchased directly through MAP, or you can order it through your local bookstore. And a lot of libraries in Maine have it as well.
Okay, and it's called Voting Down the Rose.
Voting Down the Rose, Florence Brooks White House and Maine's Fight for Women's Suffrage. And by the way, because people often ask me this, the reference to Voting Down the Rose comes from an exchange of poetry that took place in a Portland newspaper in 1915. It was sort of related to another failed suffrage referendum effort. And the Maine suffragists adopted as their flower symbol the jonquil or the daffodil, and the anti-suffragists had adopted the rose. And so in the poem that Florence writes in that newspaper in 1915, her refrain for a number of her stanzas is voting this suffrage will come to pass when we vote down the rose, or something like that. I'm sort of paraphrasing there, but voting down the rose comes from that, and it's really why not every state used the jonquil, but yellow was definitely a suffrage color. And so like Kansas used the sunflower, for example, but
Mhm.
in Maine, it was the jonquils. And so in 2019, the Maine Suffrage Centennial Collaborative urged people from all over the state to plant daffodils so that they would bloom in the spring of, yeah, there you go, 2020, in honor to commemorate the suffrage centennial. Yeah. Yeah, I've got, my daffodils are doing great this year. They're really happy.
Well, it's quite ironic. I never made that linkage, that because Margaret Chase Smith very much became associated with the rose. It really became her trademark symbol.
That's right.
But
Well, you know, times change, but I mean, when they were up in the legislature, they would literally give little flowers, both sides would, either a rose or a daffodil, to legislators to wear in their buttonholes on the days that they had important votes. And that was one of the ways they tracked who was a supporter or not.
mhm. You've come back on my radar for two reasons recently. One is you now have another book that's available. So why don't you tell people what that's about, in that I think it's also associated with the suffrage movement.
Yeah, I sort of stuck with that theme. Well, I mean, as I was doing the research for my first book, I came across this references in a lot of different suffrage histories to this cross-country road trip for suffrage that took place in 1915. And these women, 4 women leave San Francisco driving to DC with this monster petition of 500,000 names on it to bring to Congress and the president, demanding an amendment to the Constitution enfranchising women. And of course, this was launched by the Congressional Union, Alice Paul's group.
Mhm.
And I just thought that must have been one hell of a trip in 1915. And I always thought it would be fun to research that more. And finally, after I got my first book published in 2015, I found the time to retrace their route.
Mhm.
And I spent about 8 weeks in the fall of 2015 going across the country. And I blogged about it at it's www.suffrageroadtrip.blogspot.com. And
That's your account of the trip that you took?
yes, yeah. And I was meeting with women's rights activists and leagues of women voters, trying to understand what difference having had the vote had meant for women in the preceding century. And so it was really quite an education for me. I thought I was a person who knew a lot and had been paying attention, but I realized how ignorant I was, and what a tremendous opportunity and experience that was. But so my intent had been to write a nonfiction account of this trip, but I really found myself drawn to the 2 middle-aged Swedish immigrants who were pivotal to the trip's success. They actually bought the car in San Francisco and were planning to drive it back to their home in Providence. And they said, because nobody else had volunteered for this trip at this point, it had been planned for months, and they had no volunteers. And they just wandered into the Congressional Union's booth at the Panama Pacific International Exposition and said, we'll take this, we'll take the petitions. And so off they went. And I don't think they realized that it was going to completely ruin their leisurely sightseeing trip across the country. And you know, they've been very much othered and ignored by historical accounts. And I thought it was important to tell the story from their perspective. And it allowed me doing it in a fictional form to have them meet other historical figures as they came across the country, like Joe Hill, who was a famous Industrial Workers of the World activist, IWW. I have Ingeborg Ginstedt, who's also an IWW member. She was, in fact, she was a radical. She meets with him when he's in prison and when they come through Salt Lake City. And they meet with Clarence Darrow in Chicago, and Ida B. Wells Barnett, who was Barnett was a famous journalist and suffragist and anti-lynching activist. And I was able to really sort of shine a spotlight on the ways in which 1915 wasn't all that different from 2015 around issues like racism and anti-labor sentiment and anti-immigrant sentiment. So it was just a really fascinating experience. And of course, I hadn't written a novel before, so that took me some time to figure out. But I think it's a great story, and I really tried to hold true as much as I could to the facts of the trip. So it's very much embedded in the suffrage movement and suffrage history and the history of the actual trip. But then I just was embroidered around the edges when it seemed appropriate.
Well, I'm intrigued in that you said that your great grandmother was a novelist.
Yes, she was. She had
Yeah.
written those two romances of the Sudan,
Yeah.
and in this the first one was, she's a little bit milquetoast in that one, I would say. I mean, the heroine is very sort of righteous and uptight, but in her second one, she's a Smith grad. Her heroine is a Smith grad and is pro-suffragist or pro-suffrage, and also rescues the leading man from his escapades, and so I think she came a long distance in a few years just working on those novels, and I never my goal in life to write a novel, but I'm glad to have had the experience, and I got another one in mind too. But
Okay. Well, let's take this in stages. So this second book, how can people get that?
yeah, so that's also available through Maine Authors Publishing. If you go to their website and look at their books, and they're under the fiction tab, you can find it there. It's also on Amazon and available through your local bookstore. Yeah, and I do talks on both of the books actually still for libraries and historical societies, and I'm going to do one in Castine tomorrow, for example, on the first book. So people are still interested in that history.
I was going to ask you that because I still have a poster in my office of a lecture series, I think that was being done at the public library in Augusta. And you were going to give a talk there, and almost all the talks on it Candace, I think, was going to give a talk as well. They all got canceled because of the pandemic. And so again, thinking about the pandemic, I've been wondering how have book tours been able to go for you over the past year?
When the pandemic hit, I had 30 book talks lined up for the spring, summer, and fall, and all of them get canceled. Yeah. But then they, after a while, people started to get comfortable with Zoom, and so the requests started coming back. Would you consider doing this virtually? And actually, it's turned out to be a really helpful thing. I mean, I think more and more people are taking advantage of it. People who wouldn't necessarily find the time to go out on a Thursday evening, in the pouring rain or, threatening snow, are willing to sit in their homes and tune into a virtual talk. And I've had some, and I've done some talks for the senior colleges in Maine as well. And so I'm really comfortable with the format myself. Especially when there's only a small number of people on the call, we have a great chat. It's really, the discussion can be really fun.
Good. Well, I'm glad you've been able to maintain something, and as Zoom and these other meeting formats have been a godsend during the pandemic. There are some advantages to it that we find people, two factors. One, now from anywhere in the world, you can participate.
Right.
You don't have to be within driving distance of a place. And that people, I think, more and more are realizing that it can be asynchronous. You can watch it whenever you want, so long as it's being recorded and saved somewhere.
Right. I mean, I'm negotiating with Camden around a talk later this summer. And I did a talk on my first book last summer, a virtual talk that they recorded and put on their website. And they told me yesterday that 59 more people watched it after the talk than had been there. So I think I'm really comfortable with that. And of course, with this, voting down the rows was much more Maine focused. And I didn't know what I was doing. I marketed it mostly in Maine. But We Demand, The Suffrage Road Trip is my second book. And that one, I am already talking with somebody in Florida about a date for a virtual talk, and somebody out in San Francisco as well. And so I think that it'll really expedite and facilitate that kind of outreach about the book.
Well, good. I wish you success with that project. And you alluded to that you have a next project.
Well, I have several projects, but yeah, I have some nonfiction ones. I mean, one of the other things that I've been doing this last 8 months or so is working with the Maine Historical Society. They asked me to serve as a co-curator on an exhibit they're opening next month, in May of 2021, on It's called Begin Again, Reckoning with Intolerance in Maine.
Mhm.
And it's really going back to the early history of European, settlement and exploration of this new continent, new to them, and the effects on indigenous peoples, but also other ways that intolerance and the way that intolerance was enshrined in laws and customs, like I said earlier, affected people of color as well as women. And so that one has been really interesting. And that's made me think a lot about my own history in Maine. I mean, uh, I think through my mom, who was born and grew up in Portland, I have 6 or 7 generations in back. I can trace back 6 or 7 generations in Maine, which is a drop in the bucket, of course, compared to the indigenous peoples. But um, my grandfather, my mom's dad, was an attorney. His dad was also an attorney and a district attorney and state's attorney. And my great grandfather was Chief Justice of the Maine Supreme Court. So he was also an attorney. And it's made me wonder what what did they do as white men
Mhm.
to shape laws and customs that governed how, that sort of created marginalized people, or created that marginalization of people, I should say, or perpetuated it. And so that's one research project that would be a nonfiction one, is to go back and look at, I mean, what lawsuits did they file, what
Yeah.
court decisions were they involved in that shaped this. And I haven't had a chance, I've just been too busy lately, but that's definitely on my radar screen. But I have another novel that's probably way too early to think about talking about. But that was, I learned it seems a shame not to reuse those skills, such that we're so hard won, I guess.
Mhm. So this project you were just describing, it's again this idea of using family history to illuminate larger history. It's
Yeah,
interesting.
and I do have I'm working with another I'm working with 2 different kind of interns this spring, and one is a set of 3 interns who are using those suffrage petitions that we looked at
Mhm.
earlier to try and identify Black suffragists in Maine,
Mhm.
because Maine had a very small number of Black people, period, in the early 20th century, but they were active and vibrant and just like anybody else, and so they've been able to identify in Bangor alone 8 Black women who signed that 1917 suffrage referendum petition.
Mhm.
And so we're working on that. But I'm also working with another individual. She's a little older and has more training on looking at the American Plan, which was a set of laws and policies that basically gave public health departments police powers to identify and arrest and forcibly detain and test and treat women, mostly, I mean, it ended up being almost all women, who were any woman who was reasonably suspected of having venereal disease. And
Mhm.
this came out in World War One. It started in World War One, but it really took off in World War Two. And the last case around this was litigated in the 1970s. So it was throughout the 20th century, a good chunk of the 20th century, these laws and practices were on the books, and Maine participated in this. And so
Mhm.
that's another little research project. It's not directly related to my family, but I'm just really curious about that history, because we know that Maine did begin participating in the summer of 1917, and I'm just sort of curious as to how that unfolded here. So that's in the early stages also, but all kinds of fun stuff to be
Yeah, you've
looking
got a
into.
lot going on.
Yes, way too
And you
much.
reminded me, yeah, we had a little exchange about that because when you had first mentioned the American plan, you did a post looking for information. I just associated it with World War One, but then you said it comes up into like the early 1970s.
Yeah, all the case law is, protects the ability of the government to do this,
Mhm.
and there was never a successful uh, lawsuit against the state for doing this in any state in the country. There's something like 32 states participated in this. I think the last litigation, and I don't know if there was any litigation in Maine at all, but the last legal case was brought, I think it was in Seattle in the 70s, and was lost again. So, I mean, that's another concern as we see, venereal disease coming back into play with, these antibiotic resistant strains. It's also the case that in the 70s, when the AIDS crisis was coming up, I mean, they were going to use, there were proponents within the US government who wanted to use the American plan as the basis for locking up gay men, to protect society against AIDS. And I think it was C. Edward Koop was Surgeon General at the time, and he said, no, we're not going to do that. And so I think, hopefully our society has evolved, but I mean, with the wrong person or wrong, element in office and in power, you could see that going in a kind of a tough direction. And by the way, the treatment that they used initially before antibiotics were developed was arsenic. You had no say over whether or not you got treated. They would, if they decided you were, had VD, they could give you, and there weren't good tests, so they were often wrong. But I mean, they would treat you with arsenic, which itself is a toxin and was poisonous and harmed and killed people. So, certainly venereal disease is serious and needs to be taken seriously, but the men just went to the outpatient clinic, and the women got, tens and tens of thousands of women were embroiled, kind of got caught up in this American plan over the decades.
So you prompted me to do a search of our collection to see if we had anything on the American plan, which we didn't have anything by that specific designation, but I did let you know that Margaret Chase Smith during World War II was on the House Naval Affairs Committee, and she was on a subcommittee called the Congested Area Subcommittee, and it traveled around the country and went to cities that had defense installations or war production facilities. So they came to South Portland and they wrote a 40-page report. And one of the elements that they focus on is juvenile delinquency, venereal disease, and vice. So there was a great concern of that those issues during World War II. And then you had reminded me that there was a reformatory here in Skowhegan, specifically a women's reformatory, that when these issues arose, the onus was put on the women. It was for unwed women. They were sent to
prostitutes often. I mean, I think the whole idea of a woman's reformatory came out of the progressive movement. I mean, and I think its goals were good, right? I mean, they didn't want women to be locked up with men for obvious reasons. I mean, that bad things could happen. They wanted, they wanted to give women a shot at rehabilitation in a women-only facility. So in some ways, those were laudable goals, but what ends up happening is you see, and that women's reformatory movement was nationwide, and so it's often those women reformatories that get kind of like swept up into this American plan and become a site where women get locked up. And some of them, I mean, some of these places were very much like prisons. I mean, they had, barbed wire around them, and there were guards, those kinds of things. I mean, it was pretty nasty.
Well, I mentioned that because the women's reformatory in Skowhegan was just up the street from Margaret Chase Smith's house.
Yeah, and I think that, I'm going to talk with the woman, Betsy Upham, who's working with me on this tonight, but it has occurred to me that there may well be people around whose family, had ancestors who were involved in this in one way, shape, or form. And so I think one of the things we need to do next is to put out a call for, trying to get the word out to see whether or not people have these stories in their own family histories, because it was very shameful. I mean, this was a lot about locking women up, was about trying to dampen women's growing sexuality. In the early 20th century, women are increasingly leaving the farms to work in the factories. Certainly they're called to during World War I, encouraged to replace the men who went off to war. and women responded to that. But what ended up happening is there were all these young women, unwed, who are romping around these cities, and even though you're working them 60, 70 hours a week in their factories, they still find time to have some fun on the side. And some of that fun involves sex, and there's not good birth control. And so there was just a lot of fear about women's growing sexuality in the early 20th century. And that's part of what the American plan was definitely designed to control, or to threaten in some ways. So this country has always had a very weird relationship with sex, I think, and that's just one of the ways it came out.
Mhm. Well, as we draw to a conclusion, I want to refer back to the upcoming exhibit you mentioned, the Maine Historical Society, Begin Again. And just the other day, their registrar came to pick up 2 items that connect to Margaret Chase Smith, a hat and a pearl necklace. And I think there's also going to be a photo of Margaret running for president in 1964 that will be used as part of the exhibit. And I know that I think the exhibit officially opens at the end of May.
Yes.
But prior to that, I believe there is an event coming up on May 12th where the guest curators will be talking about the exhibit.
Yeah.
May 12th at 6 p.m. You can go to the Maine Historical website to find out more about it, but Anne will be participating in that. Any more you want to say about the exhibit and what your role in the exhibit has been?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I was involved in helping to write the labels for Margaret Chase Smith parts of the exhibit, and that was really fun. It gave me an opportunity to learn more about her, which I'm embarrassed to say I hadn't done before. But my co-curators, well, Tilly Lasky is the curator from Maine Historical, and she's been tremendous to work with. But my other co-curators are Darren Ranko, who's a UMO professor and member of the Passamaquoddy Nation, and then also Crystal Williams, who's a Black woman attorney based in Portland. And what a tremendous experience this has been for me, just to learn from them. I wasn't born and brought up in Maine, so there's a lot of Maine history that I don't know, and there's a lot of history about how the Euro-Americans, or the colonial settlers, kind of took over the country that we're sort of aware of, and I was taught some of that in school, but it was never, in my view, it was never presented as, look what we did. Like this was not altogether a wonderful thing. And in my history classes, it was part of manifest destiny. It's just part of what America needed to do to become the great nation that we are. And there were no apologies really, or regrets. So this has really helped spark my interest in and desire to be more mindful about this history. And I've been doing a lot more reading about it. But I think that it's going to be, it's going to spark a lot of discussion, and I hope it does. And because the Begin Again part of the title is really intended to make us stop and reflect and acknowledge the past, and to think differently about how we move forward. And that's what it's designed to do, is to help us move into a better future where we're more accepting and treat other, what we've referred to sometimes as marginalized people, but I kind of like that term, because it's like, who marginalized them? I mean, whose decision was that? What made them
also still, it leaves them on the margins still.
Right. So but people of color and LGBTQ and all the others who've had to really had to struggle and fight to become part of our mainstream society. And it's just been a great experience. I hope people go to see it. And it's going to be available online as well as in person.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with me today. And I'm amazed by all the projects that you've worked on and are working on and will be working on. And that gives people plenty of opportunities to learn more. There's your books, There is the exhibit coming up at the Maine Historical Society, and you're out there in the virtual world still giving presentations and talks.
Absolutely. And people, they can contact me also through my website, which is annbgas.com. And gas is spelled G-A-S-S. Not sometimes people try to put an R in there or an L or something, but yeah, annbgas.com.
And it's Ann with an E, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much and good luck with your projects.
Thanks so much, David. Really appreciated this.
Okay.
It was fun.